9 B-29 Superfortresses are under attack over North Korea, facing an aircraft they can't outfly, outclimb, or outrun. Their crews are calling for their fighter escorts on the radio. The fighters can hear them, they just can't reach them. The aircraft attacking them is a swept-wing jet, climbing faster and higher than anything the United States can put in the air, flown by pilots far more experienced than anyone expected to face over Korea. In 15 minutes, 6 bombers are lost. It's the first time American heavy bombers have been intercepted by an enemy they can't escape. And no one yet understands what they're up against. By the fall of 1950, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress owned the sky over North Korea. The centerpiece of the most expensive weapons program in American history, the B-29 had ended a world war. And now, 5 years later, operating along the Chinese border above the Yalu River, these crews were flying their missions in broad daylight, in formation, at altitude, against a country that had nothing left to put in the air against them. It had been doing so since the first week of the war, and after less than 3 months of systematic bombardment, Far East Air Force's commander, General George Stratemeyer, announced that practically every strategic industrial target in North Korea had been destroyed. Refineries, rail yards, munitions plants, bridges. On the morning of November 1st, 1950, 15 F-51 Mustangs were running a ground support mission, flying low, identifying targets, keeping North Korean supply lines honest. The sky above them was empty. Absolutely nothing that could threaten a formation of American aircraft. Then something came through them. The pilots caught only a glance of its shape. Wings swept back at an angle none of them had seen before, crossing the formation fast and furious. Suddenly, First Lieutenant Aaron Abercrombie's voice stopped mid-transmission. His comrades tried calling his name time and time again, to no response. By the time the other pilots understood that he'd been hit, whatever had hit him had already cleared the area and climbed out of sight. Later that same day, 3 of the same aircraft came after 10 F-80 shooting stars near the same area. The F-80 was the most advanced jet fighter the United States had in theater, and its pilots were fast enough to at least share the sky with the threat for a moment, fast enough to register the swept wings, the climb rate, the way these things moved through altitude, as though the air offered no resistance at all. Then, just like Abercrombie, First Lieutenant Frank Van Sickle was downed in his F-80C before anyone could react. On the open radio channels, the voices coordinating the attack were not speaking Korean, but they also were not speaking Chinese, though the pilots listening could not place the language. That evening, intelligence analysts pulled the gun camera footage from the aircraft that had come back and ran it frame by frame, looking for anything they could use. What they found was blurred and partial, but enough. It was a shape that had been in their files for 2 years, the MiG-15. On November 8th, Lieutenant Russell Brown pulled his F-80 Shooting Star jet fighter into a diving attack on a MiG-15 and shot it down, credited as the first confirmed jet versus jet victory in history. Though Van Sickle's loss 1 week earlier was also the first of its kind. That engagement goes unrecorded as a first for one reason. His attacker was never officially identified. One downed MiG changed nothing. There were hundreds more where that came from. Western intelligence knew the aircraft existed. They had photographs from Soviet air shows dating back to 1948. What they did not know was what this model, UN codename Fagot, could actually do in combat. But nobody had expected to see it here, in a limited conflict against a technologically inferior enemy. What they also did not know, and would not know for years, was where its power had actually come from. The most important piece of its technology was not Russian. In 1947, with Soviet jet engine technology years behind the West, and the British government looking to improve post-war relations and generate export revenue, the Rolls-Royce company sold the Soviet Union the Nien turbojet engine, one of the most capable engines in the world, along with the manufacturing license and full technical documentation. From there, Soviet engineers copied the model, refined it, and installed it into an airframe built around swept-wing research, seized from German aeronautical facilities at the end of the war. The result was the MiG-15, an engine from Britain, aerodynamics from Germany, assembled in Moscow. The aircraft was also extraordinarily simple, built with few of the redundant systems that made American jets heavier and more complex. This jet could climb faster than any aircraft the United States had in Korea, reaching altitudes where the air thinned and the laws of engagement changed. Its 50,000-foot ceiling was higher than the B-29s it was designed to destroy, as well as higher than the F-80s sent to protect them. It carried a 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons, weapons designed to tear apart heavy bombers with a single pass, outranging the 50 caliber machine guns on American aircraft by a significant margin. But the aircraft was only part of it. The MiG-15 existed to destroy bombers, and Korea was full of them. Stalin knew if the Americans established complete air dominance over the peninsula, the entire communist position in the war would collapse. The Soviet premier excitedly sent the aircraft, and with it the men who knew best how to use them, not from training schools or reserve units, but the most elite pilots in the Soviet Air Force, and whose specific job had been to defend the Soviet capital from American bombers. Pilots had to be under 27 years old, and World War II veterans were given priority. The first large unit to deploy was the 324th Fighter Aviation Division, and Stalin chose its commander personally, Colonel Ivan Kozhedub, the highest-scoring Allied ace of the war. In more than 300 missions against the Luftwaffe, Kozhedub had shot down 62 enemy aircraft, including a Messerschmitt Me-262 jet. Despite being among the first Soviet pilots to master the MiG-15, Stalin ordered him not to fly combat missions in Korea, on the grounds that his reputation was too valuable to risk. Kozhedub flew anyway, under the pseudonym Lee Si-sin. And now, on the other side of the Yalu, American pilots were trying to figure out how to bring one down. On the morning of November 9th, the Essex-class carrier USS Philippine Sea was operating in the Yellow Sea as part of Task Force 77, the Navy's fast carrier strike force. The mission was the Sinuiju bridges, the main crossing points over the Yalu River, and the primary supply lines feeding the Chinese intervention into North Korea. If the bridges came down, the logistics supporting 200,000 Chinese troops on the peninsula would come with them. Launching in sequence, the Vought Corsair fighter bombers and Douglas Skyraider attack aircraft, heavy with ordnance, prop-driven, and slow, descended toward the river first. The Grumman F-9F Panther jet fighters of VF-111 launched after, timed to arrive over the target with the strike aircraft, high enough to see the whole picture, close enough to respond to anything that came up to meet them. That morning, Lieutenant Commander William Amon, commanding officer of a Navy fighter squadron, was flying a borrowed Panther, his own having gone into maintenance overnight. His division took up their orbit at 4,000 feet over the river, where they could see the runway at Antong Airfield in Manchuria, and its aircraft parked along it in plain sight. However, United Nations rules of engagement forbade any aircraft from crossing into Chinese territory, leaving these tantalizing targets visible and untouchable at the same time. Suddenly, a voice over the radio warned about a fast-moving jet coming up behind the formation. Amon looked over his left shoulder, and right upon spotting it, he turned to meet it head-on. On board the MiG, Captain Mikhail Grachev had his eyes on the water below, still hunting for the Panthers he'd just passed through, when Amon and Holloman cut inside his turn and opened fire with 20mm rounds, peppering the Soviet aircraft fuselage. Grachev dove steeply, zigzagging, trying his best to shake them. But the American pilot followed, the airframe beginning to buffet as the Panther pushed toward terminal velocity, the controls stiffening against every input, his hands working against the stick as the speed built, all while still firing in bursts as the MiG crossed his sight. However, as his dive angle steepened more and more, the Korean hillsides began filling the canopy. At some point in the pull, Grachev's MiG flipped inverted onto its back, and according to Amon, quote, "I thought that pilot was either crazy or had one of the best fighters ever built. Then I saw trees and rocks. Pulling hard, I bottomed out with no more than 200 feet to spare." Though Amon had lost sight of the MiG in the violence of the pull, just above him, Holloman still had eyes on it. The swept-wing fighter going in hard, nose first, the impact sending a column of fire up the hillside that he could see from altitude and igniting the forest immediately. Despite this Soviet loss, the numbers game continued to favor the Russians. Only 5 days later, on November 14th, 15 MiGs came, after nearly 20 B-29 Superfortress bombers hit the Sinuiju bridges, damaging 2. The week after that, another B-29 went down, By mid-November, as the temperature began to drop, the American pilots had a nickname for the MiG-15 men: honchos, Japanese for bosses. As 1950 neared its end, Washington had seen enough. 6 weeks after the MiG-15 appeared over the Yalu, the United States still had no aircraft in Korea capable of meeting it on equal terms. The F-80 Shooting Star jet fighters were straight-winged and outclassed. The B-29s were hiding from it. The answer the Air Force reached for was the North American F-86 Sabre, a swept-wing fighter that had been sitting in squadrons stateside. It was put on a ship and rushed across the Pacific, arriving at Kempo Air Base on December 15th. With essentially no time to acclimatize and no established tactics for what they were about to face, only 48 hours later, the Sabres were in the air. The December 17th mission was led by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton, commander of the 336 Fighter Interceptor Squadron, who, after his first flight came back without contact, went up again later in the afternoon. Hinton knew the MiG pilots had been studying every American aircraft in the sky over Korea, and by now they had a clear picture of what each one could and could not do. The F-80 they knew well, but the Sabre was a completely different machine. So Hinton crossed slowly, below 475 miles per hour, using F-80 call signs on the radio. From the ground, from altitude, from any cockpit watching, his flight looked exactly like the older, slower jets the MiG pilots had been hunting for weeks. 40 minutes into the patrol, Hinton spotted 4 MiGs 7,000 feet below his formation. He jettisoned his drop tanks, pushed the throttle forward, and dove. By the time the MiGs broke formation, Hinton was already inside the turn of the lead element's wingman, Major Yakov Efremenko, close enough to fill his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger and held it. 1,500 rounds. The MiG's fuselage opened up, smoke streaming back in a thickening black trail, and then the fire caught, bright orange against the gray Korean sky, the aircraft beginning to come apart as it fell, shedding pieces down toward the Yalu Valley until it hit the ground 10 miles south of the river. It was the first time 2 swept-wing jets had fought each other anywhere in the world. That evening, one of Hinton's pilots, Lieutenant Ward Hitt, wrote home, quote, "Colonel Hinton shot down a swept-wing MiG. Can't tell you much about it, but it'll probably be in the news." With that, the rivalry that would define the air war over Korea had begun. The MiG-15 and the North American F-86 Sabre shared a common ancestry in the German aeronautical research both countries had seized at the end of the war. From certain angles at altitude, they looked similar enough that pilots on both sides occasionally fired at their own wingmen by mistake. But the performance was quite different. The MiG climbed faster, flew higher, and hit harder. The Sabre was more accurate in a dive, and its pilots better trained, but those advantages were not enough to tip the balance yet. By early 1951, the northwestern corner of North Korea had a name: MiG Alley. Soviet MiG-15 regiments were based across the river in Manchuria, on Chinese soil that the United Nations rules of engagement forbade American aircraft from attacking, or even crossing into. Soviet pilots could climb to altitude over China with no threat to themselves, cross the Yalu when they chose, fight on their own terms, and go back the moment an engagement stopped going their way. If a fight turned against them, they could pull up, hit full power, and climb out of range. To reach that airspace, the American Sabre pilots had to fly 200 miles north, burning through most of their fuel getting there, and then had roughly 20 minutes over the combat zone before they had to turn for home. Every engagement happened on Soviet terms, in Soviet time, over ground that offered the Americans no advantage and the Soviets everyone. By June of that year, the Soviets and Chinese had more than 445 MiGs in theater, while the United States had 44 Sabres in Korea and another 45 in Japan. As the year went on, swarms of up to 150 Soviet jets were crossing the river against American patrols of only a third that size. The strip of sky above the Yalu had become the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Though American signals intelligence had confirmed that more than 90% of the pilots were in North Korean uniforms, flying aircraft with Chinese markings were Soviet Air Force veterans who had fought the Luftwaffe to the gates of Berlin, neither government said a word. After all, Acknowledging it meant confirming they were at war with each other. By the fall of 1951, the Korean War was slowing down. Armistice talks had begun in July, broken down in August, and as of October had not resumed. On the ground, the front lines had barely shifted in months. With neither side able to advance without a cost that neither was willing to pay, the conflict had become a grinding, attritional standoff, consuming men and equipment. From the air, the United States Air Force was still sending the B-29 Superfortress bomber formations that had been hitting North Korean infrastructure for 16 months already. One of the key sites was Namsi Airfield. It was being built right in the heart of MiG Alley, where more than 100 MiG sat on fields that United Nations rules of engagement placed completely beyond reach. Late that October, 9 bombers of the 307th Bombardment Wing were given the job of bringing it down. After waking up at 1 a.m. on the 23rd, the men were fed, briefed, and walked out to their aircraft on the Kaduna flight line in the hours before sunrise. The Escort looked substantial on paper. 34 North American F-86 Sabre jet fighters in high cover, 55 Republic F-84 Thunder jet fighter bombers as close escort. On the notes of B-29 Bombardier Lieutenant Nick Garofas was, quote, "I hope I'm wrong, but I think the MiGs will be in the area." The aircraft commander for this crucial mission was Captain Clarence Fogler, a man the crew called Fog, who had survived the low-level Ploiesh oil raids in World War II, some of the costliest bombing missions in American history. The leader was well aware that despite having nearly 90 escort aircraft on paper, the navigation system forced each bomber onto its own individual flight path, pulling them apart across the sky rather than holding them in the tight defensive formation. Well before dawn, one by one, 9 Superfortresses taxied out in sequence, heavy with bombs and fuel, and lifted into the dark, turning north across the East China Sea. The 9 Superfortresses, heavy and slow, were near Namsi when anti-aircraft positions that had been tracking them for miles began firing, black bursts climbing through the formation, close enough to shake the airframes. 2 of the American bombers took hits before they even reached the target and held course anyway. In the nose of the lead aircraft, Bombardier Lieutenant Nick Garofas, the man who had written that morning that he hoped he was wrong, put his eyes on Namsi and released the bombs toward the airfield below. Then the interphone crackled. MiGs in the vicinity, coming from above, bypassing the North American F-86 Sabre jet fighter escorts in high cover entirely, and punching straight through the Republic F-84 Thunderjet fighter bomber close escort without slowing. With more than 100 aircraft suddenly in the same piece of sky, the largest single air battle of the entire Korean War was in full swing. Captain James Folks, commanding one of the 9 Superfortresses, took a hit on the first pass, causing his left wing to catch fire, and he lost power, falling out of formation, ordering his crew to bail out. Seconds later, Captain Robert Crumb and his men were also escaping from their own burning aircraft. Suddenly, a MiG came off the nose of the lead aircraft, pulling up hard, close enough for Lieutenant Garofas to read the rivets on his fuselage before it tore past. He opened up on it with everything he had. Behind him, through the gunner's window on the left side of the fuselage, Roland Miller watched the B-29 on their wing catch fire and slide into the clouds, 2 parachute canopies opening in the smoke behind it. More MiGs came through from above, pass after pass, 37mm cannon rounds tearing through engines and wings. The bomber crews were on the radio, calling for the escort fighters, begging them to get there in time, until one transmission came back through the noise that made their stomachs drop, quote, "Sorry guys, we can't do it." With the escort fighters too far out to close the distance in time, the bombers were on their own, and the MiGs knew it. They worked through what remained of the formation at will, hitting each aircraft in turn, until there was nothing left worth hitting. What remained of the formation turned for home. Back at Kaduna, crews who'd been grounded that day had spent the hours playing poker on an ammunition crate in their hut, watching the runway through the window. When word came that the 307th was inbound, they folded their hands, climbed into a jeep, and drove out. The men stood on the tarmac and watched the sky, waiting. Then, a single B-29 appeared out of the sky, coming in low and slow, trailing smoke, a hole in its tail section large enough to see the sky through from the other side. It was the only one to make it back to Kadena. 3 more were too damaged to ever fly again, and 3 others did not come down at all. With 6 aircraft lost in total, causing 28 casualties, the event became the highest percentage of American bombers lost on any major mission in the history of the United States Air Force. The ill-fated mission became known as Black Tuesday. Throughout it all, every single one of the Soviet-flown MiGs returned to their base. When General Hoyt Vandenberg, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, flew to Korea to meet the crews, the first thing he said when he arrived was that he wanted to talk to a tail gunner, the man who sat alone at the back of the aircraft with nothing between him and the MiGs but a .50 caliber machine gun, watching them come through from behind and unable to stop them. He wanted the man who had seen it most clearly and survived. The B-29, the aircraft that had ended World War II, that had carried the bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that had burned Japan cities from one end of the island chain to the other, flew its last daylight mission over Korea that week. It would go north again, in darkness, guided by radar, navigating toward targets it could not see. But it would never fly in daylight over MiG Alley again. With the B-29s gone from daylight skies, it was down to the Sabres and the MiGs. And Ivan Kozhedub's division was claiming 216 victories in less than a year. But this was all about to change. By late 1951 and into 1952, the Soviet World War II aces began rotating out of Korea one by one, and North Korean and Chinese pilots climbed into the same cockpits, strapped into the same aircraft, and took off from the same fields across the Yalu. While these rookie pilots expected a machine so perfect it basically did their work for them, they found that at the edge of a stall, the jet gave almost no warning before it spun and rarely recovered. The pilots who replaced them had not learned those things yet, and it showed immediately. At the same time, American Sabre pilots who had spent 2 years in MiG Alley were flying with a fluency that no amount of training could have produced. Now, they knew the terrain, knew the tactics, knew exactly where the MiGs would come from and how they would run. From there, the kill ratio against Chinese and North Korean pilots climbed to 5-to-1 or greater. By the spring of 1953, the few Soviet pilots still flying in Korea had begun avoiding engagement altogether. Stalin was dead, the ceasefire was looking inevitable, and nobody wanted to be the last casualty of a war their country was not supposed to be fighting. Through all of it, the United States Air Force had still not gotten its hands on a single intact MiG-15. Everything they knew about the aircraft they'd been fighting had come from gun camera footage, wreckage, and the accounts of pilots who had survived close enough encounters to remember details. In the spring of 1953, General Mark Clark launched Operation Moola, offering $50,000 to any communist pilot who flew a functioning MiG-15 to South Korea, and an additional $50,000 to the first one to do it. Political asylum, resettlement in any Western country of their choosing, and anonymity if desired. Though the plan was marked top secret, the press eventually outed the whole ordeal. Leaflets were printed in Russian, Chinese, and Korean, and dropped by the thousands from B-29 Superfortress bombers over North Korean air bases along the Yalu, paper falling across the runways and abandoned dispersal areas, settling into the mud. Unknown to the Air Force, by that point in the war, every communist MiG-15 pilot had been moved to fields in Manchuria, beyond the reach of American propaganda. Not a single pilot saw them. From there, MiG activity continued to drop, which American commanders chose to interpret as the operation having its intended psychological effect. In the next 90 days that followed, United Nations pilots shot down no less than 155 MiG-15s for the loss of only 3 Sabres. On July 22, 1953, North American F-86 Sabre pilot, First Lieutenant Sam Young, scored the last MiG kill of the Korean War, and only 5 days later, on July 27th, the armistice was signed at Panmunjom. After 3 years of fighting, despite the tantalizing prize money, not one communist pilot had defected with a MiG-15. Then, 56 days later, a lone MiG-15 appeared over Kimpo Air Base. On the morning of September 21, 1953, Senior Lieutenant No Kum-suk of the Korean People's Air Force peeled away from a training formation near Sunan Air Base outside Pyongyang, pushed the nose south, and dropped low to stay beneath radar coverage. He had been planning this morning for 18 months. At 21 years old, the youngest fighter pilot in the North Korean Air Force, he'd flown nearly 100 combat missions over the course of the war and had spent every one of them knowing he would keep flying until the regime no longer needed him or until he was gone. Getting out was the only goal. Not the money, not any offer he had never heard of. Just out. Sunan to Kimpo Air Base, outside Seoul, took 17 minutes at 620 miles per hour. The radar at Kimpo was offline that morning for scheduled maintenance. Nose crossing went completely untracked. He came in from the north, joining the landing pattern from the wrong direction, approaching the runway at the same time as a North American F-86 Sabre fighter coming in from the south. Sabre's pilot, Captain Dave Williams, veered hard and came over the radio, quote, "It's a goddamn MiG." Another pilot circling above, Captain Jim Sutton, said afterward that if No had come in from the correct direction, the two aircraft would have collided on the runway. No circled the field first, waggling his wings and firing colored flares, trying every signal he could think of to show he was not in attack. Ground personnel, seeing a swept-wing jet at low altitude, assumed it was a Sabre until it was close enough to read the markings. Then the gun batteries swung around, waiting pilots sprinted for their cockpits, and Gloucester Meteor jet fighters from No. 77 Squadron RAAF scrambled to defend the airfield. Every aircraft in the landing pattern was diverted to Osan and Suwon. No taxied between two parked Sabres and stopped. He climbed out of the cockpit, reached into the breast pocket of his flight suit, pulled out the photograph of Kim Il-sung that every North Korean pilot was required to carry, tore it up, and threw it on the ground. Then he put his hands in the air. As it turned out, the pilot had absolutely no idea of Operation Moola and no interest in $100,000. He just wanted to get out of North Korea. The MiG-15 was dismantled, loaded onto a transport aircraft, and flown to Okinawa, where it was given USAF markings and prepared for evaluation. On September 29, 1953, Captain Tom Collins became the first Western pilot to fly it. Major Chuck Yeager followed. And after 11 days of testing, covering the full performance envelope of the aircraft, Yeager's assessment was characteristically direct. The pilot with the most experience, he said, would win, regardless of what they were flying. After Korea, the MiG-15 spread across the world, flying with the air forces of more than 40 nations. Over 15,000 were built in total. Its successor, the MiG-17, carried the same swept-wing design into Vietnam, where it outmaneuvered American F-105 Thunderchief fighter bombers and F-4 Phantom jet fighters that outweighed and outran it, and still could not shake it in a turning fight. North Korea never stopped flying it. More than 70 years after it first appeared over the Yalu, the Korean People's Army Air Force still operates a small number of MiG-15s as advanced trainers, using the aircraft that shocked the West in 1950 to teach the next generation of pilots how to fly. It's among the oldest military aircraft still in active service anywhere on Earth.